I see we're a bit thin on the ground, lots of people absent, getting their essays ready and second midterms and things like that. This is another site, the first site for a long time that I've talked about this, not in the textbook, but this really is one of the most significant discoveries that have been made in archaeology in the late 20th century, and this is the discovery of the Uluburun shipwreck. Turkey has always been very famous, ever since ancient times, for its sponges. Sponges, the water absorbent skeletons of marine creatures. You use it in the bath, you use it for all sorts of things, you use it in the kitchen and so forth. The best Turkish sponges are found on the south coast of Turkey at depths of usually between 30 to about 50 meters. And sponge divers, for years, just going down, sort of holding their breath, would frequently find ancient shipwrecks while looking for sponges. Over time, of course, the different sponge divers learned how to recognize the date of these shipwrecks. Many of them were quite modern, metal ships or occasionally wooden ships. And as more and more shipwrecks began to be found, the divers themselves, the sponge divers, began to see that they could date the shipwrecks by the type of pottery that turned up. Here, for example, we have examples of amphorae, the wine and olive oil storage jars used in the Greek, the Roman and the Byzantine period. That one stands about so high, that's much shorter, that's about a metre and or so high there as well. So divers could recognise it when they found a shipwreck of the classical period. Sometimes, though, divers would find the wrecks of wooden ships, obviously rather old, with different types of pottery on them. They couldn't always date these. They weren't really interested in archaeology, let's face it. So they would find these shipwrecks and basically not say very much about them. Well, this is what happened in 1954 when a sponge diver called Kemal Aras, diving off Cape Gelidonia, not far from Finike, found himself at a depth of about 26, 28 meters below the sea level in the remains of a wooden ship covered with sponges. The ship roughly straight down from here. He saw that this shipwreck had lots of pottery on it, pottery of a completely different type from anything he'd seen before. So he reported it to the police when he came back from his dive and hoping that somebody might take some interest in it. Now, 1954, there was no such thing as underwater archaeology. 1958, when the first archaeologists heard about this shipwreck, there still wasn't anything that we know as marine archaeology. It was an English archaeologist who was travelling in that area, looking for sites of Bronze Age date, heard about this shipwreck, looked at some of the pottery from the shipwreck, and realised it was Bronze Age in date. This meant it was a remarkable find. This was the oldest known shipwreck in the world at that time. So the English archaeologist Peter Throckmorton started spreading word around about this, but nobody could quite believe that there had been a shipwreck of Bronze Age date here. It was known that there must have been very extensive trade in the Bronze Age period, because you find objects from Africa, from Egypt, in Mycenae, and at Troy and places like that. But nobody could really think of there being trade by sea. So Peter Throckmorton encouraged the diver who found the shipwreck, Kemal Aras, to go back down to it. And as you can see, he's using one of these old-style diving suits. It's not that far below the sea level, 26, 28 meters. And Kemal Aras came up with some more examples of pottery, confirming that this was a shipwreck of Bronze Age date. So, in 1960 began the first ever underwater archaeological excavation at Cape Gelidonia, directed by Peter Throckmorton, who didn't dive, and by a young man called George Bass, who trained specifically as a diver to work on this site. And here we have George Bass and Peter Throckmorton looking at some of the finds from the shipwreck there. Well, it was soon discovered that most of the shipwreck, the wood of the shipwreck, basically gone. But the objects that had been carried in that ship survived in incredibly good condition. And a very interesting discovery quite early on was that obviously lots of things had already been removed from the ship. It wasn't intact. It was, just sort of at the right depth for people to get down to. But what they started to find when they started to excavate it was large numbers of bronze and copper objects. And in particular, scrap bronze objects. Broken bronze axes like this, broken bronze chisels, and metalworking tools. What this indicated was that the shipwreck must have been carrying what we call scrap bronze for recycling. Bronze can be melted down and you can make new bronze objects from it. So this was clearly a ship that was carrying a lot of scrap bronze as well. But in addition to the scrap bronze, the ship was also carrying at least 34 of these ingots. An ingot, the name we give for any bar or lump of metal, something like that. These are in a very characteristic oxide shape. They weigh about 25 kilos, something like that, and they're very typical of the Bronze Age. They're made in this particular way, actually, so that they can be carried. This is a bronze incense stand from Cyprus. Cyprus, the name basically means the copper island, and you can see this shows a man carrying one of these copper ingots like that. Well, this was really a very important discovery. Peter Throckmorton and George Bass realizing that they've got really one of the most sensational discoveries of the archaeological world in the 1980s. To make bronze, though, you need tin. The proportions vary, but roughly you have about 88% copper, 12% tin. And the shipwreck also produced ingots, lumps of tin as well. This made it a really exceptional find because it's in the Bronze Age, the only sources of tin were in North Spain, Germany, northwest France, southwest England, and a small quantity which actually can be found in Italy. Tin and bronze are never found together. Well, that's not quite true. There's one place in Iran where they are found together. How people discovered that you could make bronze by mixing tin and copper, we still don't really know. Quite possibly in Mesopotamia. But basically, to get tin, people had to trade over great distances, even as far as the southwest of England. So the shipwreck, the Cape Caledonia shipwreck, producing all sorts of, the first ever archaeological excavation underwater of the oldest shipwreck known in the world at that time. It could be dated quite happily to the late Bronze Age, roughly the late 13th century, because the ship also had examples of this type of pottery, Mycenaean III pottery. This is what we call a stirrup jar because of the type of handle. It's the same type of pottery that's found at Mycenae in the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age. So more or less roughly the same sort of date as Mycenae. This started to indicate the importance of the ship. The general belief at this particular time, ever since Schliemann had worked at Mycenae, ever since Evans had worked at Knossos, was that the Mycenaean people, or the people of Knossos, basically controlled trade in the Mediterranean. So it was assumed that this must be a Mycenaean shipwreck. But then the archaeologists working on the Caledonia shipwreck started to find other objects that hinted that it might not actually be Mycenaean. For example, there was a cylinder seal, roughly about 3 centimeters long, the type of thing that I've shown you before, found at cylinder seal, Syrian type or Canaan type, an Egyptian scarab, things like this. A whole range of objects suggesting that the ship might actually have been Syrian in origin or even Egyptian. Pottery of Syrian type, personal pottery, the sort of things that people would use for cooking and eating out of. Well, some people started to do more and more research into the possible origin of the shipwreck. Now, just to locate you, Crete is over here, Mycenae is up here. I think I got Mycenae in the wrong place on that map. Mycenae is down there, actually. Never noticed that one before. Mycenae is on the south side of the Peloponnese. Cape Gelidonia over here. Crete, Knossos there, Cyprus, the principal source, really the only source for copper in the Bronze Age period. So the objects on the ship seemed to threaten the general assumption that the Mycenaeans had controlled trade in the eastern Mediterranean, that basically this was a ship that came from Canaan, or possibly Phoenicia, but certainly from Syria. As work started on processing the finds and preparing the report, another interesting discovery was that when Egyptian war paintings were examined, it was seen that these showed merchants, traders, who came from Syria, not from Mycenae. And the Egyptian word for a trader basically meant the same as Assyrian. So this started to raise the very interesting possibility that the existing theory, the Mycenaean people had controlled trade in the Bronze Age, might be wrong. It might actually be a case that the people in Syria or Canaan controlled the trade, international trade at that time. What was needed, of course, was another shipwreck of Bronze Age date. And such a shipwreck finally came to light in 1982 at Uluburun, not far from Kash. Kash, up here. Anybody been to Kash? Good, nice place, isn't it? It used to be even nicer 20 years ago. Oops. Yes, I am that old. Right, so Kash up here, Uluburun down here. Again, a sponge diver, Mehmet Shakir. He was diving at a depth of something like 50 meters below the sea level, 30 or 50 meters, when he found another wooden shipwreck just off the side of Uluburun, roughly where the dive boat is there. And again, finding examples of a type of pottery he had not seen before. He had heard of the Cape Gelidonia discovery in 1954, Cape Gelidonia excavated in 1960. This started marine archaeology. George Bass was the founder of marine archaeology. Ever since Cape Gelidonia excavation, George Bass had been working in Turkey. So the diver at this site, Mehmet Shakir, knew who he had to report the find to George Bass. George Bass dives down on the shipwreck in 1982 and sees this. A mass of Bronze Age pottery lying on the floor, mixed in with copper ingots like that. He could see at once that this was an undisturbed shipwreck. The depth it was lying at, 50 meters below the surface. Nobody had ever seen this shipwreck until Mehmet Shakir dived on the site. The Cape Gelidonia shipwreck had been robbed. It was in relatively shallow water. But what George Bass could also see from the types of pottery that was found in the Uluburun shipwreck, this was slightly older than the Cape Gelidonia shipwreck. He could also see that vital clue that everybody was hoping somebody might find one day, that this was a ship which was pretty definitely of Syrian or Khanite origin. The clue was these blocks of stone like that with a hole in the middle. These are anchor stones for holding the ship in place. Length of rope attached to the stone goes down into the water, it holds the ship in place overnight or in harbour. But this type of anchor stone was made and only used in Syria and in the Levant, the eastern part of the Mediterranean region. So this could not be a Mycenaean shipwreck. Obviously, work had to start on excavating this site. Work began in 1983. It continued until 1994. there were over 22,000 separate dives on the ship, up to a depth of 61 meters. Very early research established that the ship was made of cedar wood. Well, cedar wood was the best wood for shipbuilding in the classical period. Cedar wood from Lebanon. And it's quite possible that this was made of Lebanese cedar, although it's not possible to be exactly certain. It was possible to show very early on in the excavation that this was a ship that had been about 50 meters long. It had had a carrying capacity of something like 20 tons. It had obviously sunk during a storm or something like that. The bow had run up against a rock. The ship had gone down to a maximum depth of 60 meters intact. So everything was left inside the ship. A lot of the hull, the wooden parts of the ship, had disappeared, but enough was left to indicate that this was built in a very, very important way. What we call the shell-first shipbuilding technique. Now, this is the oldest, or one of the two oldest shipwrecks in the world. And the method of construction used in this was, unlike the clinker method, unlike the carvel method, but rather similar to the carvel method. What you have is a row of planks which are joined together by wooden pieces like this. It's a method of shipbuilding that was in common use in the Roman period and in the Greek period. Basically, you make holes in two opposite pieces of wood. You put a mortise, these are called mortise holes. You put a tenon in and you bang everything together like that, and it holds it very well. Well, enough was preserved the ship to allow, first of all, a model to be made of it, indicating it was something like 15 meters long or thereabouts. But in fact, it was so well preserved that it was then decided to make a replica of the Uluburun ship. And here we see a replica of the Uluburun ship under construction in 2007. And there it is as she was finished. She was actually sailed from Iskenderun to Istanbul, and some of the crew were archaeologists from our Department of Archaeology. But there is the Uluburun ship, the replica at Uluburun itself. Well, as I said, the depth of this shipwreck, an average depth of around about 50 meters below sea level, meant that it had never been explored before. Sponge divers, working without diving apparatus, can get down to about 20-25 meters. But you need diving gear to get any deeper than that. And the diver who was working here, Mehmet Shakir, said this is the first time anybody had explored this area, so it was known to be a completely undisturbed shipwreck. And when they finished excavating it, they had excavated 18,000 complete unbroken objects. The excavation revealed, as you might expect to a certain extent, that the main cargo, the main sort of type of goods that the ship was carrying were copper ingots. And here you see a simplified plan of the shipwreck, and you can see these characteristic copper ingots there. You can also see the typical stone anchors of Syrian and Carnite type there as well. The copper ingots, the stone anchors, could be planned in such a way as to actually reconstruct the way the ship had been, or the contents of ship had been placed in a specific order. So you've got the copper ingots here at the front of the ship, at the bow of the ship, right in the center, the deepest part of the ship. And here you see the copper ingots actually being excavated. Well, the Cape Galedonia shipwreck produced something like 50 examples altogether of these copper ingots. Uluburun, 354. Each of them weighing something like 25 kilo, so essentially something like 10 tons of raw copper. You can see they are heavy. 25 kilo is quite a weight for a single piece of copper. Most of the copper ingots came in those characteristic oxide forms, but there were a few that were shaped like a bun, and some of them even had marks on them. The copper itself could be analysed, well, even without analysing it, it could be said that this almost certainly must have come from Cyprus. The Latin word for copper is kupros. Cyprus is the copper island. Cyprus' main source of copper throughout the Bronze Age, right going down into the Roman period as well. Now, as I said, the other raw material that you need to make bronze is tin. And here you have a selection of ingots from the Uluburun shipwreck. You can see the copper ones here, the very clear green ones. The white lumps are pieces of tin, which must have come from either Spain or Britain. It's possible it could have come from Afghanistan. There is that very slight possibility. But as far as we know, although tin can be found in Afghanistan, Afghanistan never supplied tin to the Mediterranean world. We do know there was a very intensive trade between Greece and Britain in the classical period. Is referred to in literary sources. So this tin quite possibly comes from Britain. It could come from Spain. Well, these are raw materials for making bronze. You've got this large amount of tin there, something like 40 ingots of tin, 354 ingots of copper altogether. But the really astounding discovery about the Uluburun shipwreck was that it was carrying lots of other raw materials as well. This is not a trading ship that's just specialising in the copper trade, taking copper from one place to another. For example, there was a large number of these, something altogether 176 ingots of glass, lumps of raw glass. Now this was a very exciting find in many ways. We don't know where glass was first developed. Classical sources suggest that the first glass was developed in Syria, and certainly on the beaches there. And the beaches in Syria, the type of sand you find there, silica sand, if you burn it, it will turn into glass quite easily. So it's quite possible that these glass ingots actually come from Syria. We can't prove it one way or the other. But the other thing about this is, wherever they were made, these are on a ship. They are being taken from one place to another to be made into glass vessels. So this is trade very much in raw materials. There was a whole collection of pottery found as well. There were 150 examples of this type of pottery. Carnite jars, they stand roughly about that high. But what was fascinating was that these jars contained terebinth resin. Terebinth resin is a natural oil, a sticky type of oil that you find in a particular type of pistachio tree, a particular type of pistachio tree that only grows in Iran. So the mystery is deepening in very many ways about Uluburun. We know that terebinth resin was used in the ancient world for making perfume. It was also used for preserving wine. Wine can go sour very quickly. Ancient wine goes sour very quickly unless you add resin to it. Terebinth resin was the best type of resin for this. And anybody been to Greece? Retsina. The most popular wine in Greece is Retsina. It's wine that's had resin added to it to preserve it. But what we have on the Uluburun ship is 150 jars that contain resin being taken. Well, it obviously has to come from Iran. This is where the particular type of tree grows, being taken from the Levant in jars for export somewhere else. Whether for making perfume or for preserving wine, we obviously don't know. Another astounding find were pieces of ebony wood. Well, ebony wood is very dark wood. You can see it on the right-hand side there. A type of wood that only grows in Central Africa, not in North Africa or South Africa, Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. So again, what we have in the Uluburun ship is another raw material. In Egypt, ebony wood was used for making furniture. Presumably, this is ebony wood that's on the Uluburun ship for trade, raw material, just like the terebinth resin, the glass ingots, being taken from one place to another for making furniture at the destination. The Uluburun ship also produced several examples, several pieces of elephant ivory. Well, ivory can be used for furniture decoration, it can be used for jewellery, but elephant ivory has to come from Central or South Africa. So this is something else on the Uluburun ship, which has come a long distance to get to that ship for export. In the ancient world, if you wanted to cheat somebody and say, oh yes, I've made this beautiful thing out of ivory, you would make it out of hippopotamus teeth. Well, in the Bronze Age, hippopotamus could be found in the River Nile in Egypt. But again, what we're looking at in the Uluburun ship is yet another example of raw material that's being taken from its place of origin to an unknown destination for conversion into something else. One of the really surprising discoveries was a whole collection of tortoise shells. Poor old tortoise had been killed, its shell removed, because these were used in the classical world for making the sound box for an instrument known as a kithara. So what you have on the Uluburun ship is a collection of raw materials gathered together, put on the ship for export from one place to another to make musical instruments in this particular case. There were also several ostrich eggs from South Africa. Well, we saw one of these in the class on Mycenae. Ostrich eggs were used for making rhytons. So this was what the ostrich eggs are doing on that particular ship as well. There was also a small bag that contained a lot of scrap gold. Pieces of gold, broken pieces of gold, broken jewellery, this sort of thing, old jewellery that was of no use to anybody. Clearly this had been collected together by somebody on the ship for sale to somewhere else. But the most astounding thing about this scrap gold was that it did contain a scarab seal. A gold scarab seal with the name of Nefertiti on it, the wife of Akhenaten. I'll come back to this because it's actually a very, very important find in many ways. Besides the raw materials that were on the ship for export somewhere else, there were some finished materials as well, finished objects. So there were, for example, little ivory perfume boxes like this of a type that are known to have been made in Egypt. But there were also some very remarkable small yellow beads. You have them there. Well, these are actually made of amber. Amber is only found in one place in the world, in the Baltic Sea, the north coast of what is now Poland and Germany. That's the only place where you can get amber. So the Uluburun ship has got materials on it which have come from the other side of Europe, not just from Africa as well. There were blue faience beads over there, those small blue beads of the type made in Egypt, and a collection of various bits and pieces of stone, carnelian stone from the Indian Ocean, pierced beads for making necklaces there. The large collection of copper ingots apart, the biggest amount of material on the ship, though, was a whole collection of Cypriot pottery. Types of pottery clearly made in Cyprus. So this, again, is being traded as raw material from one place to another. Fortunately, the conditions of preservation were so good that, as you can see in this replica, we can see that the pottery was being carried in little baskets, square baskets like this, wrapped up with straw all the way around it. Then in addition to these objects for trade, one very small figure made of silver with a golden head, golden feet, golden hands, who stands above that high. It's possible this might be the protective deity, a goddess that actually protects the ship, but it's a type of figure that is only found in Syria, again hinting to the actual origin of the ship. There's also a lot of objects that clearly belong to the crew, and these started to raise really very interesting questions about the origin of the ship. There were, for example, spearheads of a type made in the Balkans, in the wider Balkans region, so modern Greece, what used to be Yugoslavia. There was a mace head, a stone mace head, of a type that is very common in Bronze Age Bulgaria, not found anywhere else. There were a mixture of tools of specific types that could, of the types found at Mycenae and also in Syrian, and also a collection of swords and daggers as well. This is that Bulgarian axe hammer head in detail there. The personal objects of the crew also included little oil lamps over there, which had been used, but oil lamps of a type that are only made and found in Syria. And perhaps this, the most surprising discovery of all, what was clearly originally a wax tablet book. Well, you can see the wooden framework. Originally, this would have been inlaid with beeswax. You can write on it, you scratch on it, you can rub it out if you make a mistake, or you can reuse it. Unfortunately, the wax from this book had gone, so we don't know what was written in that book. Presumably, it was a list of what was on the ship. The discovery of this, though, helped solve one of the longest puzzles in archaeology. On many sites of Bronze Age date, people had found little pieces of bone shaped like this, a hole in the middle, and two holes on either side, and everybody thought it was a musical instrument of some kind. But actually, these are the hinges for the book. So we now know, actually, that wooden writing tablets were in existence from quite an early period, long before the Roman period, which is when we have most of them. A few objects of Mycenaean date, or Mycenaean origin, 2 Mycenaean swords, 1 Mycenaean seal. So this started to give an idea as to the nature of the crew of the ship. Who was on the ship? We cannot say, we'll never be able to say for certain who the crew were. But the mixture of objects, Mycenaean weapons like this, personal weapons, Syrian oil lamps, a Syrian goddess figure, all these things point to perhaps a couple of Mycenaeans being on the ship. The Bulgarian axe head might have come with them as well, but probably the crew were actually Syrian. The fact that many of all the anchors were of the Syrian Carnite type, though, does point to this ship essentially being of Syrian origin, trading in that particular area. Well, what was this ship doing? The key question, what date was it? When did the Uluburun ship sink, and when was it built? Well, the scarab seal of Nefertiti found on the ship indicated that the ship must have sunk after she died. Problem is, and this is where the Uluburun ship is really very important, we have this enormous problem in giving the dates for Egyptian rulers. We've got 3 different chronologies. Nefertiti might have died as early as 1360 BC, or as late as 1350 or 1324 BC. But the Uluburun ship produced pottery of a type which had been found at Miletus on the south coast of Turkey, in levels at Miletus, which we know relate to a destruction of Miletus in 312 BC. This points to a later date for Nefertiti having died. This late 14th century date for the Uluburun ship is confirmed by dendrochronology. Now, I told you about dendrochronology briefly in the class on radiocarbon dating, tree ring dating. Well, dendrochronology, tree ring dating, showed that some small pieces of wood on the ship, which had presumably been collected for making a fire or for cooking, had been cut down 1319 plus or minus 2 BC, 1318 plus or minus 2 BC. In other words, the crew of that ship were cutting down some small pieces of wood for cooking on board the ship between 1321 and 1316 BC, which is an incredibly tight date range. So the ship must have sunk shortly after that date. The scarab seal of Nefertiti was on the ship as scrap gold. It would have arrived or would have become scrap gold soon after her death. It wouldn't have been lying around for a long time. I mean, this is the seal that belongs to a dead queen. It would have been melted down to make gold, or reused to make gold, pretty soon afterwards. So what all this means is that the Uluburun ship helps tie in the Egyptian chronology, indicating that Nefertiti died nearer to 1324 BC than 1360 BC. So the Uluburun ship actually helps us fix Egyptian history. Dendrochronology was also able to suggest a probable date for when the ship was built. One piece of wood was probably from the ship, we can't be certain, was dated to 1441 BC, plus or minus 37 years, which all indicates that the actual ship was nearly 100 years old at the time it actually sank. Well, analysis of the material from the Uluburun ship is still going on, although the excavation finished something like more than 10 years ago. There's such a variety of material that's been found there. But what the material has shown us is that the previous idea that it was people in Mycenae and Crete who controlled trade in the Mediterranean is wrong. It's people in Syria and Canaan who controlled the trade. And we can reconstruct the trade route of the Uluburun ship. She would normally start off in this type of area, possibly as far south as Gaza. That's where all this material from Africa, like the ebony wood, would have come from, the ostrich eggs, the hippopotamus teeth, the elephant ivory. It would have come from Central South Africa, eventually making its way along the Nile to Memphis, Heliopolis, or one of these places, and then overland to Gaza, Joppe, that sort of area. On board the ship, there's a lot of material from Canaan here, but there's also terebinth resin, which has to come from Iran. There's also tin. The tin's got to come from Spain or Britain, less likely from Italy, just possibly from Afghanistan. But how the tin could have got to this area, we don't know. The ship was probably built in this area, started to set sail from this area. Its main destination is Cyprus. Cyprus to Copper Island, which is where it takes on all these copper ingots. It's obviously got a connection with Mycenae. We've got the Mycenaean seals, we've got the Balkan objects and things like that. So at some earlier date, the ship must have been over in this area. Then on its final voyage though, it got only as far as Uluburun before actually sinking. The Uluburun shipwreck then is really one of the most dramatic and important discoveries that's been made in Turkish archaeology in the past 20 years. There's another one, Göbekli Tepe, which I'll talk about in the last class, another site of international importance. But what's really quite fascinating about this whole thing is it gives us, with the Cape Gelidonia shipwreck, just over here, of a slightly earlier date, is suddenly the doors are open to our mind. You don't really think about international trade, large-scale international trade in the Bronze Age. It must have happened because we've got the objects. The copper has to come from Cyprus, going all over the Mediterranean. Tin has to come from Spain or Britain. But it actually points to this very, very fundamental aspect of an incredibly well-organized trade around the Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age. It's also got a rather interesting effect in the sense of the Bronze Age ends and the Iron Age begins sometime around about 1100 BC, not long after the Uluburun ship sank. We see this change from bronze to iron, and it's not easy to understand why. You can find iron everywhere, but making iron requires heating the raw material to a temperature of 1200 degrees, which is not easy. Making bronze requires lower temperatures, but it does need tin. Well, we can see what happens around about this time period is when there's lots of migrations going on in this whole area. We have references in Egyptian literature to the Sea Peoples attacking Egypt. We have the collapse of the Hittite Empire, around about the same sort of date. We've got the collapse of the Mycenaean Empire, the destruction of Knossos, all about the same date. We can argue for hours about what's going on. But clearly with these mass destructions or invasions, attacks on these major settlements, well, you can see trade beginning to collapse in a way. If trade collapses and you can't get tin and copper, you have to find something else. Well, the people in the Hittite Empire had discovered how to make iron around about 1500 BC. But nobody could be bothered to make iron. It's not as good as bronze. A bronze sword stays sharp longer and is less likely to corrode than an iron one. But with the collapse of this big trade network, which we can identify thanks to Cape Caledonia and the Uluburun ship, you can see why you have to go through the stage from the Bronze Age into an Iron Age. All right, I'll stop at this particular point. How am I doing for time? Early, I know. Yeah. I see we're a bit thin on the ground. There's lots of people absent, getting their essays ready and second midterms and things like that. This is another site, the first site for a long time that I've talked about. This not in the textbook, but this really is one of the most significant discoveries that have been made in archaeology in the late 20th century, and this is the discovery of the Uluburun shipwreck. Turkey has always been very famous, ever since ancient times, for its sponges. Sponges, the water absorbent skeletons of marine creatures. You use it in the bath, you use it for all sorts of things, you used it in the kitchen and so forth. The best Turkish sponges are found on the south coast of Turkey at depths of usually between 30 to about 50. Always date these. They weren't really interested in archaeology, let's face it. So they would find these shipwrecks and basically not say very much about them. Well, this is what happened in 1954 when a sponge diver called Kemal Aras, diving off Cape Caledonia, not far from Finike, found himself at a depth of about 26, 28 meters below the sea level in the remains of a wooden ship covered with sponges. The ship roughly straight down from here. He saw that this shipwreck had lots of pottery on it, pottery of a completely different type from anything he'd seen before. So he reported it to the police when he came back from his dive, and hoping that somebody might take some interest in it. Now, 1954, there was no such thing as underwater archaeology. 1958, when the first archaeologists heard about this shipwreck, there still wasn't anything that we know as marine archaeology. It was an English archaeologist who was travelling in that area, looking at meters, and sponge divers, for years, just going down, sort of holding their breath, would frequently find ancient shipwrecks while looking for sponges. Over time, of course, the different sponge divers learned how to recognise the date of these shipwrecks. Many of them were quite modern, metal ships or occasionally wooden ships, and as more and more shipwrecks began to be found, the divers themselves, the sponge divers, began to see that they could date the shipwrecks by the type of pottery that turned up. Here, for example, we have examples of amphorae, the wine and olive oil storage jars used in the Greek, the Roman and the Byzantine period. That one stands about so high, that's much shorter, that's about 1 metre and or so high there as well. So divers could recognise it when they found a shipwreck of the classical period. Sometimes, though, divers would find the wrecks of wooden ships, so obviously rather old, with different types of pottery on them. And they couldn't age date. So, in 1960 began the first ever underwater archaeological excavation at Cape Gelidonia, directed by Peter Throckmorton, who didn't dive, and by a young man called George Bass, who trained specifically as a diver to work on this site. And here we have George Bass and Peter Throckmorton looking at some of the finds from the shipwreck there. Well, it was soon discovered that most of the shipwreck, the wood of the shipwreck, basically gone. But the objects that had been carried in that ship survived in incredibly good condition. And a very interesting discovery quite early on was that obviously lots of things had already been removed from the ship. It wasn't intact. It was, just sort of at the right depth for people to get down to. But what they started to find when they started to excavate it was large numbers of bronze and copper objects. And in particular, scrap bronze objects. Broken bronze axes like this for sites of Bronze Age date. Heard about this shipwreck, looked at some of the pottery from the shipwreck and realised it was Bronze Age in date. This meant it was a remarkable find. This was the oldest known shipwreck in the world at that time. So the English archaeologist Peter Throckmorton started spreading word around about this, but nobody could quite believe that there had been a shipwreck of Bronze Age date here. It was known that there must have been very extensive trade in the Bronze Age period, because you find objects from Africa, from Egypt, in Mycenae, and at Troy and places like that. But nobody could really think of there being trade by sea. So Peter Throckmorton encouraged the diver who found the shipwreck, Kemal Aras, to go back down to it. And as you can see, he's using one of these old-style diving suits. It's not that far below the sea level, 26, 28 metres. And Kemal Aras came up with some more examples of pottery, confirming that this was a shipwreck of bronze.